Hello everybody, my name is John with Walks 101, and this is Out of Isolation, the show where us out-of-work tour guides come to you and go out into the city so you don't have to. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Lucy. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, yes, my name's Lucy and I'm a tour guide with Walks 101. I've been working as a tour guide off and on for the last 5 years in Berlin, Germany, and also here in Melbourne, Australia. I'm a born and raised Melburnian. I'm also a born and raised Tigers supporter.
Well, there you go. That's exactly why we have you on today, Lucy. I am standing right here. This is Federation Square behind me, the Ian Potter Center. But off in the distance over this way, you'll just be able to see some lights poking up. Let's see if I can adjust the camera a bit to get a better view of it. The lights poking up right there, which is the largest stadium by area in the Southern Hemisphere. Lucy, where are you?
I'm here. I'm at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, otherwise known as the MCG. We locals will call it the G. And it is the 11th largest stadium in the world, and yeah, the largest in the Southern Hemisphere, often known as the home of Australian rules football. The Melbourne Cricket Ground, the MCG, was first built back in 1853, but it was a cricket ground first and foremost, so they actually didn't play Australian rules football here first up. When the first Australian rules football game was played between Melbourne Grammar and Scotch College in August of 1858, they played it over here on the park area. They didn't want the game of Australian rules football to mess up the cricket pitch too much. So it wasn't until 1869 that they played the first Australian rules football game back here on the ground. So the next time that you come to the football and you bring the kids to have a kick to kick before or after the game, bear in mind that you'll be kicking the ball around on the space where they played those first few games.
Well, that's a lot of information, Lucy. You're the biggest football fan that I know, which is why I wanted to make sure to have you on. Also, this is great because I can see the MCG way in the distance, and I feel like if there could be a possible better example of social distancing, I don't know what it is, because you're literally about a kilometer away from where I am right now. But Lucy's got a lot to share, and I wanted to make sure to have her on the show because she knows so much more than me about football. But before going too far, I just want to take a moment to explain what football is for the people who aren't from Australia watching this right now. So first off, when I say football, I'm not talking about soccer, I'm not talking about American football, I'm not talking about Gaelic football. What we're talking about here is AFL, Australian Rules Football. AFL is a unique sport. It's invented right here in Australia, in Victoria, actually. And one of the challenges that I have whenever I talk to Australians about footy is they can't explain it. It's one of those things like you can't ask like a professional piano player exactly how to play a concerto because they know too much about it, and the same is true here. And so what I'd like to do to start us off is try to give my very rudimentary explanation of what football is, and so that Lucy can fill in the gaps. Is that okay with you, Lucy?
Sounds great.
All right, so you're gonna have to forgive me because I know you're like a hardcore football fan. I'm gonna overly simplify it. So anyone who's watching this, who's like a lifelong footy fan, I'm very sorry. But for anyone else, here we go. So to understand what Australian rules football is, I want you to understand soccer. You know, Brits call it football, but terminology is confusing here. That game with the black and white ball that you kick into a net, that's where you want to think of from the very start. So football is soccer. Just think of it like this way. But instead of playing the game on a rectangle, like you do for soccer, we play it on an oval. That oval is about 3 times bigger than a normal soccer field. On top of that, we get rid of the nets. The nets are no more, and instead of nets, we put 4 posts in. If you kick the ball through that center post, that's 6 points. If you kick the ball to the post on the side, that's 1 point. And all the rules of AFL are basically trying to get the players to drop the ball. And so, for example, you can run with the ball as long as you want, but if you run more than about 3 paces, you have to dribble it. Now, I haven't mentioned, the ball isn't shaped like a soccer ball, it's shaped like a rugby ball, and so it'll dribble out of control. The other thing that you can do is you can pass it, but it's not just like an American football pass. You have to do like an underhand volleyball pass where you hold underhand volleyball serve where you hold the ball in one hand, you use the other hand to punch it out of your hands, and then finally you can kick the ball, which is powerful but also extremely inaccurate. So all the rules of Australian rules football, in my opinion, are trying to get the players to drop the ball. And so the entire game is basically all these players just running desperately after a ball, wearing jerseys that are way too small for them and shorts that are way too short for them, just scoop up the ball and then kick it to the goal. Now, the game itself is incredibly active. In general, a game will make all the players run the equivalent of a marathon, which is incredible to watch. But that's my very, very basic footy explanation. Lucy, how much are you cringing right now?
I mean, what I feel like saying is when you've gone that the game is essentially trying to get the players to drop the ball, the football fan inside of me just wants to shout out, "Dropping the ball, umpire!" So that's another great aspect of Australian rules football, is that there are umpires on the ground as well. And as supporters, you often spend as much time barracking for your team as you do disagreeing with the umpire's calls and interpretations of all those rules that make up Australian rules football.
Can I just pay some respect for the umpires as well, though, because I went to one of the finals last year, and I've never seen a man run backwards as fast as I can run forwards, faster than I can run forwards. The athleticism of these officials, where do they find them anyway?
Pardon?
Where do they find these officials?
Where do they find the umpires?
Yeah.
Well, you're asking someone who's grown up watching AFL, and usually we disagree with the umpires quite a lot, so we would say that the umpires are just failed footballers.
Ruthless.
They've got the endurance to be a player, and as you say, they're extremely fit. They can run backwards really well, but maybe they just dropped the ball too much, and so therefore they didn't get into their teams.
That's brutal. Well, your tiger stripes are really showing right now, Lucy. One of the other things that I want to make sure people are aware of is that being a fan is not in the U.S., where I'm from, is not really the same as barracking for a team, which is a whole other thing. To barrack for a team here is like a religion. So, Lucy, why don't you tell us about your experience of barracking, which is what the Australian word is for being a fan of, for the Tigers has been like, and how you became a Tiger fan.
Yes, no, of course. Well, I'm actually standing right now out the front of the statue of Kevin Bartlett on the Avenue of Legends on the way up to the Melbourne Cricket Ground. What better place to talk about being a Richmond supporter than out the front of the statue of KB, who was a 400 gamer for the Richmond Tigers, who played 200 games on the Melbourne Cricket Ground, which is more than any other player, past or present. Pretty much the reason why I am a Tigers supporter is the same reason as why many Melburnians support their teams. That's who my nana goes for. It all comes down to your grandparents. If we were to rewind back to the pre-World War II years, so I'm talking about the 1920s and the 1930s, who you barracked for was where you lived. So it was where you were born. My nana was born in 1928 in Richmond, so of course she barracks for the Richmond Tigers. And there was a lot of sort of drawing down those district lines, and my nana tells a story of her friends who barracked for Collingwood refusing to walk down the street next to her if Richmond had won a game. My father, who was born in 1956, his friends who barracked for other teams wouldn't go home on the train with him if the Tigers had won. After the Second World War, it stops being about where you live, and it's now where you're born to, so who your family supports. It's not uncommon for children to be born in Melbourne, all throughout Australia really, and one of those first photographs that's shown has them wearing the colours of their family's club. After the 1950s, there is a lot of immigration to Melbourne, and the areas where people moved into, once again, that's usually the team that they end up picking up. It's one of the reasons why you do have a lot of Italian families who support Carlton. There was a lot of Italian immigration into Carlton. It's why you have a lot of Greek families who support Richmond, because they moved in to Richmond. And one of the I would say most famous Richmond supporters at the moment is Peggy O'Neill, who is our president. She is originally from the United States. She moves into the suburb of Richmond. That becomes their team. What about you, John? How did you barrack for your team?
Yeah, Lucy, it's a really good question. I think I had a pretty typical experience of a lot of foreigners who come here and tell a footy fan that I didn't know anything about it and I was interested, because before you knew it, my now wife's flatmate's father, who was a lifelong Saints fan, St. Kilda Saints, he heard this, and he doesn't even live in Melbourne. He lives in Wagga Wagga, which is 5 hours away from here. But when he came down here, he made sure to find me, introduce himself, put a cap on my head with St. Kilda Saints, a scarf around my neck. He brought me to what's now called Marvel Stadium, was then called Etihad Stadium, and he sat me down and he bought me a ticket and showed me the game, and he converted me to be a Saints fan. He didn't tell me so much about the record of the St. Kilda Saints, which I wasn't aware of, but I so appreciated just the hospitality that he showed as he tried to win just one more lifelong member of the St. Kilda Saints.
Yeah, I'm not too sure that he was trying to show you hospitality, John, as much as he was just trying to get another supporter for his team. It is the lifelong goal of any football fan, anyone who strongly barracks for their football team, to try to get people to convert to the faith. So when we talk about getting married or meeting new partners in our family, for instance, they've got to be Richmond supporters. Both my sister-in-law and my future brother-in-law, they weren't Richmond supporters originally, but you bet they are now.
I'm picturing like a West Side Story told in Melbourne, but with Collingwood and what's that?
But with football.
Yeah, totally. We got Tony and Maria. Tony, the Collingwood supporter, and Maria, the Richmond supporter. Can their love ever find a way?
Can their love survive the divide that is the Richmond-Collingwood rivalry? I don't know.
Something that happened before we were born, well, not before we were born, but when we were probably too young to remember, is that the VFL became the AFL. And so I wanted to talk about that for a second because it's fascinating to me. My dad grew up in Brooklyn, and he still talks about the heartache that came when his beloved Brooklyn Dodgers left and became the LA Dodgers, and he just didn't have a baseball team anymore. In 1993, I believe it was, the Victorian Football League decided to expand their appeal and become the Australian Football League, the AFL, as we know it today. And they took a bunch of teams here, and then they sent them to other parts of Australia. So, for example, the Fitzroy Lions became Brisbane Lions, right?
That did that. So, for example, the Fitzroy Lions became the Brisbane Lions. But before that, there was a team called the Brisbane Bears. So, when the VFL became the AFL, they did try to take teams that were already based in those cities. For example, there was also the West Australian Football League. There was the South Australian Football League. So teams like Fremantle, West Coast, the Adelaide Crows, Port Adelaide, and originally the Brisbane Bears, they came from those state leagues. When Fitzroy Lions and the Brisbane Bears became one team, it had a lot to do with finances as well as getting some support up in Brisbane. But my uncle, who was a mad Fitzroy Lions supporter, he followed the team. He decided to continue barracking now for the Brisbane Lions. So he doesn't get to go to many games of his team, but he still decided to stay faithful, which worked out really well for him when the Brisbane Lions won 3 premierships in a row.
Well, it would be remiss of us to come all this way and have you outside the MCG and not talk about the original club that started it all. Lucy, are you an MCC member as well?
I am indeed. Yes, I have my MCC ticket right here. I never leave the house without it. It is like the golden ticket of the Melbourne Cricket Ground. I'm actually outside of Gate 2 right now. I've been standing here outside the entrance to the Melbourne Cricket Club. I've got 2 people to thank really for this MCC ticket. The reason why it is such a golden ticket for the Melbourne Cricket Ground is because I can get into any AFL game any cricket game, pretty much any event that happens here at the MCG, there is this special pavilion for the members. And the reason why I'm so lucky to become a member, thanks to two people. One of them is my dad, who put me on the waiting list when I was born, back in the year, let's go out of the sunshine this way, back in the year 1990. The waiting list as it stands today has over 200,000 names on it. So if you put your name on the list now, you might see your membership in the mail in about 40 years time. The other person that I have to thank for my MCC ticket is none other than John Cain, who is a former Premier of Victoria from 1982 to 1990, because prior to 1983, the MCC, the Melbourne Cricket Club, was a men's only club. But John Cain didn't like the fact that when he came to the game that his wife couldn't sit in the pavilion with him. So he challenged the MCC to be more inclusive. They didn't really like the sound of that, so John Cain decided to threaten the MCC by saying that if they didn't admit women into their membership, then they weren't going to get a liquor license the following year. He threatened to introduce a law that said if you discriminate against anybody, you won't be getting a liquor license. So the MCC, they had a choice between having alcohol and admitting women. So in 1984, the first women were admitted into the Melbourne Cricket Club.
I love that that's the negotiating tactic. We're going to take your beer.
Unless you let the ladies in. And ladies could come into the pavilion. They had what was called a ladies pass. So everyone who was a paying member of the MCC had a ladies pass. But what John Cain wanted is that he wanted women to be admitted as members. And so thanks to him, I've now got one of these, a full membership of the MCC.
And around what time was this that women were allowed in, Lucy?
So they were allowed to become members back in 1984.
Awesome. So, it's a pretty forward-thinking organization. 1984 is Dolly Parton 9 to 5 era, right? We're talking about women in the workplace.
Yeah.
But I've actually come here where we're going to wrap up our video today to talk about a place that hasn't really changed as much, which is the very, very old school Melbourne Club, this building just behind me. In fact, right now with coronavirus, it's all dark because I think they have to close just like anyone else. But this is a very stately institution that is still to this day men only. Melbourne starts in 1835. The Melbourne Club starts in 1839. So I'm just showing a plaque right here of the National Trust sign. This is a gentleman's club, and gentlemen's clubs are all over the world. The idea being it's a place where men can come and gather to discuss affairs of the day. It's something that really kind of became popular in the 19th century. But this Melbourne Club has been here, and actually was a little bit in the news because of just what you're talking about, Lucy, about that thing of only allowing men, because they had a political fundraiser where only men were allowed, and it caused a bit of controversy in a city where we've actually taken some of our road crossings and made them, instead of green and red men, green and red women. And so this club here is a very exclusive club, still for men only, but just across the street from it is this building here, the Ladies Club. The Ladies Club is built later, and when the Ladies Club is built, this wall goes up, just to make sure that the Men's Club can continue to be as exclusive as it is. But then what happened, the Ladies Club actually built an addition. So if you look up one level, you'll see an expansion built over. And just about then is, I don't know if you can see this, see on the wall, there's a ridge here. They put an extension on the wall. So I like to imagine a bit of a cold war between these two buildings as they get higher and higher and higher. That's about all that we have for you today. Lucy, is there anything else that we've left out that you'd like to share?
Just one thing that I would like to share as I'm standing now in front of the Olympic stand of the Melbourne Cricket Ground. I love telling people about this. The first time that the Olympic Games were held in the Southern Hemisphere, the opening ceremony and the main arena was the Melbourne Cricket Ground as well. And just here on the outside of the Olympic stand, we've got the lists of all of the gold medal winners from those Olympics, which is also a pretty cool thing to visit when you're at the G.
Pretty relevant as well with the news that just came out in the last day that the Tokyo Olympics are going to be suspended till next year. So if anyone's looking for their Olympic history, they can come down to the Olympic Park down that way.
There you go.
So Anyway, thank you so much for joining, Lucy. This has been Out of Isolation. If you have enjoyed this video, there's a few things you can do that would help us out tremendously. The biggest thing you can do is just go down there and hit subscribe. If you go onto the YouTube page, subscribing actually gives us a lot more features that lets us do this more professionally. The next thing you can do is just tell other people about this. Just tell other people about this thing, share it out with other people. If you want to share it on social media, that helps. And we are just working on a Patreon page as well, where you can contribute, because all of us tour guides are now out of work with the coronavirus, and so this is our idea to try to earn a bit of an extra living. We're going to have some options for you to contribute to help us keep this thing alive. But that's all from me today. I have been John with Walks 101. This has been Out of Isolation. Lucy, I'll let you say goodbye and take us out.
See you later, everyone. Thanks for joining us. That's what we call a goal. Well done. Excellent.
Yeah, we'll see what the recording turns out. But I'm really excited. I think we got some good banter there.
Yeah, no, that was. I think that was a lot more. I mean, I haven't watched your video from yesterday yet, but I did see your little disclaimer that you hadn't. That it wasn't live.
Yeah, it was the fake live.
Yeah, fake live.